It all started with a letter. It was one of those official-looking envelopes. Stiff white paper with bold letters across the front. Homeowners Association, Notice of Violation. At first, I thought it was junk mail. Maybe another pointless HOA newsletter, telling me about some barbecue I didn't plan on attending. But when I opened it, the words hit me like a punch in the chest. They were fining me. The reason? My fence, according to them, the wooden fence that had stood around my backyard for years, was now considered unsightly. They claimed the shade of brown I had chosen years ago was incompatible with the aesthetic standards of the community. The letter made it sound like I had committed some terrible crime, when in reality, it was just a wooden fence with a slightly faded coat of paint. I stood there reading and rereading the letter, trying to make sense of it. My fence wasn't new, sure, but it wasn't falling apart either. It wasn't crooked, it wasn't broken, and it certainly wasn't hurting anyone. But to the HOA, it was apparently an eyesore that needed to be corrected immediately, else I would face escalating fines. At first, I laughed. It seemed ridiculous. A fence color. That was the problem. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This wasn't about aesthetics. This was about control. The HOA had been tightening its grip on the neighborhood for years, with more rules, more restrictions, and more fines. It felt less like a community and more like a dictatorship, run by a handful of people who enjoyed flexing their power. And of course, leading the charge was Karen. Every HOA seems to have one, and ours was no exception. Karen was the president, and she treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. If she didn't like something, she found a way to make it a violation. She had already gone after people for things as small as the color of their curtains, showing from the street, or a lawn ornament she didn't approve of. My fence had simply become her new target. But as much as I hated the idea of paying the fine, I wasn't going to let this one slide. This wasn't about money. It was about principle. So, I did what anyone would do. I went to the HOA office. The office was really just a small room inside the community clubhouse, with a cheap desk, a filing cabinet, and Karen sitting in her usual spot, sipping from a coffee mug that read Boss Lady. She smiled when she saw me walk in, but it wasn't the kind of smile you give a neighbor. It was the kind of smile you give when you know you've already won. I showed her the letter and asked her what the problem was. She didn't hesitate. According to her, the natural wood stain I had used years ago had faded to a dull, grayish brown that clashed with the community's design palette. She said it looked weathered and degraded, and that it distracted from the uniform appearance of the neighborhood. In other words, she just didn't like it. I argued, of course. I pointed out that half the fences in the neighborhood were older than mine. Some were leaning, some had broken boards, and some hadn't been touched in decades. Why was mine suddenly a problem? Karen shrugged and said those fences had been grandfathered in. But since mine had been refinished just a few years ago, it was subject to the current standards. The logic made no sense. But logic wasn't the point. Control was. I left that meeting with a sinking feeling in my stomach. They weren't going to let this go. If I didn't comply, the fines would keep coming, and if I didn't pay, they could place a lien on my house. It was a trap, and they knew it. That night, I sat on my back porch, staring at the fence. It wasn't perfect, sure, but it was mine. I had built it with my own hands, spent weekends hammering nails and brushing on the stain. It wasn't just wood and paint. It was effort, pride, and a small piece of independence in a neighborhood that seemed to value conformity over everything else. And that's when the idea came to me. If they thought my fence was ugly, fine. But what if I gave them something really worth talking about? What if I didn't just repaint my fence? What if I transformed it into something so bold, so unforgettable, that the entire neighborhood would have no choice but to notice? Not an eyesore, but a spectacle. The thought made me smile for the first time that day. Suddenly, I wasn't angry anymore, was motivated. Karen and her HOA wanted a fight over aesthetics. Fine. I'd give them a makeover they'd never forget. The next morning, I grabbed a notebook and started sketching ideas. Bright colors, patterns, maybe even murals. Nothing they could call damaged or degraded. Everything would be neat, intentional, and artistic. It wouldn't break any rules about safety or structure. It would simply be different, of course. I knew this wouldn't be easy. The HOA thrived on finding technicalities, and Karen wasn't. Going to sit quietly while I challenged her vision of the neighborhood? But I also knew that sometimes the best way to deal with bullies wasn't to avoid them, it was to outsmart them. As I sat there planning, I realized this was bigger than just a fence. This was about the entire neighborhood, about all the people who had been quietly bullied into compliance over petty rules. If I could stand up and show them it was possible to push back, maybe others would follow. Maybe Karen's reign of control wouldn't last forever. And so, with that thought, the battle truly began. The HOA had fired the first shot with their letter. Now, it was my turn to respond. And I wasn't just going to repaint my fence. I was going to change the entire neighborhood. The morning after I received the violation notice, I stood in my driveway watching the neighborhood wake up. Cars pulled out one by one. Neighbors watered their lawns. Kids waited for the school bus. Everything looked normal on the surface, but once you've been targeted by the HOA, you start seeing the cracks, the forced smiles, the hesitation in people's voices, the way everyone tried to stay just far enough under the radar, so Karen wouldn't notice them. I didn't want to be one of those people, so I started planning. The HOA rules were vague, but deliberately so. Words like uniform appearance, community standards, and aesthetic consistency sounded official. But in practice, they meant whatever Karen and her inner circle wanted them to mean. There were no paint swatches, no official guidebooks, just a moving target designed to keep everyone in check. That vagueness was going to be my advantage. If they couldn't define ugly, then how could they define beautiful? I drove to the hardware store with a simple goal: find the brightest, boldest colors of exterior paint they had. I walked past the muted browns and grazed the safe choices most homeowners used, went straight for the shelf with fire truck reds, yellows, ocean blues, and neon greens. I grabbed buckets of every shade that screamed for attention, loaded them into the back of my truck, and headed home. But paint wasn't enough. This needed to be bigger, smarter, and undeniable. So I spent hours online researching what other homeowners had done to fight back against overreaching HOAs. I found stories of people planting wildflower gardens instead of lawns, painting murals on garage doors, even turning their houses into art projects just to expose the hypocrisy of neighborhood rules. Some lost their battles, but others won not, because they broke the rules. But because they proved the rules had no clear boundaries. That was the path forward. The first weekend, I got to work. I started with the fence facing the street, carefully sanding down the faded boards. Neighbors slowed their cars as they drove by, some waving, others staring curiously at the rows of paint cans stacked neatly on the lawn. By Saturday afternoon, the first coat was on, a bright, bold blue that gleamed in the sunlight. By Sunday, I added stripes of red and yellow, then green, then purple. Soon, the once unsightly fence had transformed into a giant canvas of color. It wasn't messy. It wasn't sloppy. It was precise, measured, and intentional. Each board was painted with care, turning the plain wooden barrier into something closer to modern art. By Monday morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. People walking their dogs stopped to take pictures. Kids pointed and laughed as they rode, passed on their bikes, Some neighbors whispered that it looked ridiculous, but others quietly told me they loved it. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive. Asterisk, of course. It didn't take long for the HOA to respond. Asterisk, that same week, I found another letter in my mailbox. Same envelope, same bold letters. Notice of violation. This time, the complaint was that my fence was out of compliance with community color standards. But here was the thing: those standards didn't exist. There was no official document, no rulebook, no list of approved colors. It was just Karen's opinion. It's written down and sent as though it carried the weight of law. Asterisk, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. Asterisk, at the next HOA meeting, the clubhouse was packed. Usually, only a handful of people showed up. Karen, a few board members, and maybe one or two homeowners with minor complaints. But this time, the chairs were full. People stood along the walls, murmuring about the fence before the meeting even started. Asterisk, Karen walked in, wearing her usual smug expression, holding her binder like it was a weapon. She started with the usual agenda: landscaping updates, budget allocations, the summer block party. But everyone was waiting for the same thing. Eventually, she got to it. Asterisk, the issue of property compliance, she said, tapping her papers. Specifically, the matter of the fence on Maple Street. All eyes turned to me. Karen launched into a speech about visual harmony and protecting property values. She claimed my fence was distracting, unapproved, and in violation of HOA expectations. Her voice carried the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. Asterisk, but this time, she didn't get nods of agreement. She got silence. Asterisk, finally, one neighbor spoke up. He pointed out that his fence hadn't been painted in over a decade and was covered in peeling paint. Why wasn't that a violation? Another neighbor mentioned that her shutters were a shade of green no one else had. Was that against the rules too? Questions piled up, and Karen struggled to keep control. Asterisk, I didn't have to say much. I just reminded everyone that there was no official list of colors, no guidelines, nothing in writing that made my fence a violation. All Karen could say in response was that the board had discretion, which only made people angrier. Asterisk, by the end of the meeting, it was clear the tide was turning. For once, the HOA wasn't dictating the conversation, the homeowners were. And it all started because of my fence. Asterisk, that night, I sat on my porch looking at the colorful boards glowing under the streetlights. I realized this was no longer about me. It was about the entire neighborhood waking up to the truth. The HOA's power was only as strong as our willingness to comply. Asterisk, but I also knew this wasn't over. Karen didn't like losing control, and something told me she wasn't going to back down quietly. In fact, I was certain of it, because when I checked my mailbox the next morning, there was another letter waiting for me. Asterisk, this time, it wasn't about my fence. Asterisk, it was about my house. The new letter was thicker than the first two. That alone told me Karen was escalating. When I tore it open, my suspicion was confirmed. Asterisk, this time, the HOA wasn't just going after my fence. They were going after my entire house. Asterisk, the notice claimed my home's exterior paint was faded, the roof shingles aging, and even the mailbox non-compliant. They listed everything they could think of, piling on accusation after accusation until it looked like my home was a crumbling disaster zone. None of it was true. My house was well kept, my roof solid, my mailbox sturdy. But the point wasn't accuracy. The point was pressure. Karen wanted me to feel cornered, and to be honest, for a moment, it worked. Asterisk, I sat at my kitchen table reading line after line, feeling the weight of it pressing down on me. Each violation carried a fine, and if I didn't pay, they could escalate. I knew the power the HOA had. They could place a lien, drag me into court, even try to force a foreclosure. I had seen it happen to others before. Good people. Blindsided, worn down until they gave in or lost everything. Asterisk that night, sleep didn't come easy. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had gone too far. The fence had been a statement, sure, but had I painted a target on my back that was too big to handle? Was I risking my home just to prove a point? Asterisk. But then, I thought about the meeting. I thought about the way neighbors had started speaking up, the way Karen's grip had slipped when people asked questions she couldn't answer. That wasn't just a small victory, was proof that she could be challenged. Proof that we didn't have to bow down every time she barked an order. Asterisk and I realized. Backing down now would undo all of that asterisk. So instead of giving in, I doubled down. Asterisk the next morning, I walked around my house with a notebook in hand. If they wanted to claim my exterior paint was faded, fine, I'd repaint. But not in the beige and gray shades Karen preferred. No, I was going to match my fence. Bold colors, sharp lines, deliberate design. Something they couldn't call faded or damaged because it would be brand new, fresh, and professional. Asterisk, by the end of the week, contractors were on site. They primed the house and began layering in shades of deep blue with accents of bright yellow along the trim. It was striking, vibrant, and completely unique compared to every other cookie-cutter home on the street. Neighbors stopped to watch, some clapping, some shaking their heads. But no one could ignore it. Asterisk, when the work was done. My home wasn't just a house, it was a landmark, and it drove Karen mad. Within days, I got another letter. This one demanded an immediate reversal of the paint job or face escalating fines. They cited community guidelines again, but still failed to provide any official list of what was and wasn't allowed. It was just more vague language, stretched thin over her personal dislike. Asterisk, but this time, I wasn't the only one pushing back. Asterisk, a few doors down, another neighbor decided to repaint their shutters a bold shade of red. Across the street, someone else installed flower boxes in bright colors. Little by little, the neighborhood began to change. People realized that if I could resist the HOA, so could they. My fence had sparked something bigger, an unspoken rebellion against years of unnecessary control. Asterisk, the next HOA meeting was chaos. The room was packed again, voices louder this time. Karen tried to hold the floor, waving violation notices in the air, but people weren't buying it anymore. Homeowners began demanding copies of the official guidelines. They asked where the approved color list was, why some properties had been ignored for years, and why the rules only seemed to apply when Karen wanted them to. Asterisk, her answers were thin. She stammered, deflected, and when pressed harder, she snapped. For the first time, her calm, smug mask cracked. She raised her voice, insisting the board had full authority. But her outburst only made things worse. Asterisk, by the end of the meeting, homeowners were murmuring about petitions, about voting out the board, about taking back control of the association itself. Asterisk, Karen had picked a fight with me over a fence, but she had accidentally sparked a movement. And she knew it, because later that week, I noticed something strange. Asterisk, a car sat parked across the street from my house for hours, engine off, windows tinted. The next day, I saw a man walking the block, snapping photos of my property, my fence, even my backyard. I asked who he was, but he ignored me and kept taking pictures. Asterisk, it wasn't hard to guess where this was coming from. Karen wasn't just relying on letters anymore, she was building a case. Asterisk, if she couldn't win with intimidation, she was going to try to bury me in paperwork and legal action. Asterisk. And I had a feeling the battle was about to get a whole lot uglier. The man with the camera wasn't just a random passerby. By the third day, it was clear he was working for the HOA. He circled my property, crouched down to get close-ups of the fence boards, the roof shingles, even my lawn. When I asked him directly what he was doing, he simply muttered something about documenting violations and walked away. Asterisk, it was intimidation. Plain and simple. Asterisk, but what Karen didn't realize was that intimidation only works when you feel powerless. And by now, I didn't. Asterisk, the neighborhood was changing. Neighbors who had been silent for years were suddenly stopping by to talk. Some offered encouragement. Others confessed their own frustrations with the HOA. One elderly couple admitted they had paid thousands in fines over the years just to avoid confrontation. Another family said they had been threatened with legal action for planting flowers outside their approved color palette. Every story added fuel to the fire. Asterisk, it wasn't just about my fence anymore. It was about everyone who had been pushed around. And then the lawsuits started. One afternoon, I came home to find a thick envelope taped to my door. Inside was a formal notice. The HOA was filing legal action against me for non-compliance with community standards. They were demanding the removal of my fence design, the repainting of my home to an acceptable color, and payment of thousands in fines. Asterisk, reading the document, I felt the weight of what Karen was trying to do. She wasn't just fining me anymore. She was trying to break me, to drag me into court and bleed me dry until I gave in. Asterisk, but if she wanted a war, she was going to get one. Asterisk, the very next day, I met with a lawyer. I brought the letters, the photos, and most importantly, the lack of any official documents outlining these so-called rules. My lawyer flipped through the papers and smiled. He had seen this before. HOAs thrive on fear, he explained. But when you drag their vague rules into a courtroom, they often fall apart. What Karen was doing wasn't enforcement, it was harassment. We filed a counterclaim. At the same time, I started organizing. The neighbors who had once watched from a distance were now ready to take action. We began circulating a petition to remove Karen and the current board. House by house, signature by signature, the list grew. People who had quietly grumbled for years were now eager to sign, eager to finally have their voices heard. Asterisk, and as the petition grew, so did the neighborhoods. Transformation. Asterisk, fences started changing color. Lawns sprouted wildflowers. Garage doors got fresh coats of paint in every shade imaginable. What started as my single protest fence had turned into a full-blown movement. Our street, once dull and uniform, had become a patchwork of individuality. Asterisk, Karen hated it. Asterisk, she stormed through the neighborhood with a clipboard, scribbling notes, snapping pictures, issuing more violation notices than ever before. But the more she tried to tighten her grip, the more people slipped through her fingers. Instead of fear, her letters were met with laughter, with rolled eyes, with neighbors tossing them straight into the trash, and the tension kept building. By the time the next HOA meeting arrived, the clubhouse was standing room only. The air buzzed with energy, half the crowd furious, the other half fed up. Karen walked in, clearly rattled, but still trying to project confidence. She called the meeting to order, launched into her usual monologue about property values. But the room erupted before she could finish. Asterisk, people shouted questions. They demanded answers. Where was the official rulebook? Why were some homes targeted while others were ignored? Why were fines issued without evidence? Karen tried to talk over them, but the louder she got, the louder the crowd became. Asterisk, finally. Someone stood up and presented the petition. A thick stack of signatures, enough to trigger a recall vote. Karen's face went pale. She grabbed the papers, flipped through them in disbelief, and tried to claim they weren't valid. But it didn't matter. The momentum had shifted. Asterisk, that night, the meeting ended in chaos. Voices echoing through the clubhouse as Karen stormed out. For the first time, she wasn't in control. But victory wasn't certain yet. The lawsuit was still moving forward. Court dates were being set. Lawyers were preparing arguments. Karen wasn't backing down, and the HOA board, at least the members still loyal to her, were pouring everything they had into the fight. As for me, I prepared to. I documented everything, kept records of every notice, every photo, every conversation. My lawyer built the case brick by brick, showing the pattern of harassment. The lack of clear rules, the arbitrary enforcement. It was exhausting, but I wasn't alone anymore. The neighbors rallied behind me, dropping off meals, helping repaint, even chipping in money for legal fees. What started as one man's battle had become a community effort. And deep down, I knew that whatever happened in court, the neighborhood would never be the same again. Karen had wanted to make an example out of me. Instead, she had made herself the villain of the entire community. And the final act of this war was about to play out, not in letters, not in meetings, but in a courtroom where her vague words would finally meet the weight of the law. The morning of the hearing, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds, as if the weather itself knew what was coming. I drove to the courthouse with a folder full of documents, every notice, every photo, every scrap of evidence I had gathered since the first violation letter. My lawyer sat beside me, calm and steady, assuring me we had everything we needed. But still, the weight of it pressed down on me. This wasn't just about paint on a fence anymore. This was about my home, my reputation, and the principle that one person's opinion shouldn't dictate an entire neighborhood. When we walked into the courtroom, Karen was already there. She sat at the front with two other board members and the HOA's attorney, flipping through papers with her usual air of superiority. But I could see it in her posture. Her shoulders were stiff, her smile too forced. For the first time, she looked nervous. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The HOA's attorney went first, laying out their case. He spoke of community, harmony, aesthetic integrity, and the importance of maintaining property values. He painted a picture of my fence and house as a garish eyesore, a disruption to the uniform charm of the neighborhood. He cited vague bylaws about compliance and discretion, leaning heavily on the idea that the board had the authority to decide what was acceptable. On paper, it sounded strong. But the more he spoke, the more holes became obvious. When it was our turn, my lawyer stood and calmly dismantled their claims. He presented each violation letter and pointed out the lack of specific rules to back them up. He showed photos of other homes in the neighborhood peeling paint, broken fences, unapproved shutters, all untouched by violations. He called it what it was: selective enforcement. Then he handed the judge the petition signed by dozens of neighbors, proof that the HOA board was no longer trusted to represent the community. Finally, he turned to the stack of paint cans I had brought as evidence. Yes, I had brought the actual cans of paint. He showed the labels, all marked for exterior use, all high quality, all in compliance with state and city codes. He pointed out that nowhere in the HOA documents was there a list of approved colors, shades, or patterns. The courtroom was silent as he concluded with a simple truth. Your Honor, my client followed every written rule. What he did not follow were the unwritten preferences of one individual enforced without authority. That is not compliance. That is control. Karen shifted in her seat, whispering frantically to her attorney. The judge leaned back, expression unreadable, and asked a few pointed questions. Where was the official list of approved colors? The HOA attorney admitted there wasn't one. Why were other properties with clear damage left alone while mine was targeted? He stumbled, saying something about board discretion. The judge raised an eyebrow. That was all it took. When the decision finally came, it felt like the air itself cracked open. The court ruled in my favor. The HOAS case was dismissed. Their fines were voided. Their demand to repaint my fence and house was rejected outright. Not only that, but the judge ordered them to pay my legal fees, citing harassment and arbitrary enforcement. Karen's face turned red as the words sank. The room buzzed with quiet whispers, board members avoiding her gaze, neighbors exchanging looks of relief. It was over. At least, the legal part? But what happened next was something no courtroom could decide. Word spread fast through the neighborhood. By that evening, people were knocking on my door, congratulating me, thanking me for standing up, even offering to help repaint their own homes in celebration. The victory wasn't just mine, it belonged to everyone who had been too afraid to fight back. The following week, the recall vote was held. With the petition and the court ruling hanging over her, Karen didn't stand a chance. The ballots came back, and by a wide margin, she was removed as president. Several of her closest allies were voted out as well, replaced by neighbors who had signed the petition and promised to restore fairness. For the first time in years, the HOA felt like it actually belonged to the community, not to a dictator. In a cardigan with a clipboard. I should have felt satisfied. And I did. But there was one last piece to the story, one final moment that cemented everything we had gone through. Because as the new board was sworn in, Karen stood up, grabbed her things and stormed out of the clubhouse without a word. No smug smile. No fake wave. Just silence. The neighborhood she had once controlled had finally slipped from her grasp. And as I walked home that evening, the street alive with color-bright fences, painted shutters, blooming gardens, I realized something. It hadn't just been about fighting Karen. It had been about reclaiming individuality, about proving that a neighborhood's beauty came not from uniformity, but from the people who lived in it. The war was over. And for the first time in a long time, we had won. The weeks after the courtroom victory felt different. The air in the neighborhood seemed lighter. The tension that had hung over every street corner for years finally starting to fade. People smiled more. They waved when they passed by. For the first time, it felt like we were a community again, instead of tenants living under someone else's rules. The new HOA board wasted no time making changes. They announced that all existing violation notices issued under Karen's leadership would be reviewed, and many were thrown out altogether. Fines that had drained families for years were forgiven. Most importantly, they began working on an actual rulebook, clear, specific, and fair, so no one could ever twist vague words into personal vendettas again. And just like that, the power Karen once held crumbled into dust. But it wasn't just the HOA that had changed. The neighborhood itself transformed before my eyes. Houses that had once blended into a dull beige row began to bloom with color. One family painted their shutters bright red. Another added sunflowers along their fence line. Someone even turned their garage door into a mural of a sunset, the colors stretching across the driveway. What had once been a neighborhood defined by uniformity was now alive with personality. And the funny thing, property values didn't crash like Karen always claimed they would. In fact, they went up. Real estate agents began noting how vibrant and unique the community felt. Buyers liked that the neighborhood had character, that it wasn't just another cookie-cutter development. The very thing Karen had feared most had become the thing that made the place special. As for my fence, it remained exactly as it was, striped with bold colors, standing tall as a reminder of what we had gone through. People still stopped to take photos. Kids still laughed when they rode past on their bikes. Neighbors still used it as a landmark when giving directions. It wasn't just a fence anymore, it was a symbol, asterisk, and yet, even with all the victories, I sometimes thought about Karen. She had disappeared almost completely after being voted out. No more morning walks with her clipboard. No more smug smiles at the mailbox. Rumor had it she put her house up for sale not long after. Unable to stand living in the neighborhood she could no longer control. Asterisk, I didn't miss her presence, but I did think about what her downfall had shown us. Asterisk, control only works when people stay silent. Fear only lasts as long as no one dares to challenge it. Once someone pushes back, once someone says no, the whole illusion starts to fall apart. Asterisk. That was the real lesson. Asterisk, one person with a paintbrush had turned the tide. Not because of the fence itself, but because it reminded people they had choices. They didn't have to live under arbitrary rules. They didn't have to give in to intimidation. They could stand up, push back, and reclaim what was theirs. Asterisk, months later, the neighborhood held its first block party under the new board. Tables lined the street, food cooked on grills, kids ran between houses laughing. And for the first time in a long time, people stayed outside instead of hiding behind their doors. They weren't worried about whether their lawn was trimmed to regulation height or if their holiday decorations were too bright. They were simply enjoying life. Asterisk, as I stood by my fence, plate of food in hand, a neighbor I barely knew came up to me. He pointed at the fence and said, "You know, this is where it started." I nodded, because he was right. What had started as one violation letter had grown into a movement. What had started as Karen's attempt to break me had ended up breaking her hold on everyone. And what had started as frustration had turned into pride in our homes, pride in our neighborhood, and pride in standing up for ourselves. Asterisk, when I looked down the street that evening, saw something I hadn't seen before. Freedom. Asterisk, freedom. Painted in bright colors, freedom planted in gardens. Freedom written in the laughter of neighbors who no longer looked over their shoulders. Asterisk, and in that moment, I knew the fight had been worth it. Every letter, every meeting, every sleepless night. Because in the end, it wasn't just about a fence. Asterisk, it was about proving that a neighborhood isn't beautiful because it looks the same. Asterisk, it's beautiful because of the people who live in it. Asterisk, and no HOA rule, no Karen, no clipboard could ever take that away again.